country will not be tolerated. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Our nation is in the midst of a historic crime wave that's affecting Americans of every background and walk of life. This surge in violence includes a shocking rise in hate crimes against our fellow citizens of Asian descent. Last year, the total number of hate crimes in America's largest cities dropped by 7%, but they surged by nearly 150% against Asian Americans. Often, these hate crimes target the elderly and the frail, people who can't even fight back against their vicious assailants. Just last month, a 65-year-old Asian American woman was knocked to the ground and repeatedly kicked in broad daylight on the streets of New York City while her attacker shouted anti-Asian slurs. We later learned that her attacker was a convicted murderer out on parole, thanks to criminal leniency policies. Instead of being in prison locked up where he belonged, he was brutalizing an innocent victim in broad daylight. Yet more proof that being weak on crime doesn't reduce crime, it only invites more crime. A civilized society can't ignore such attacks on our innocent citizens. We have to protect them. We have to protect every citizen and get tough on violent hate crimes. Unfortunately, in response to this terrible rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, Democrats initially introduced an extremely partisan bill intended to score political points. This flawed piece of legislation that the senator from Hawaii originally sponsored contained provisions tailor-made to muzzle free speech. For example, the bill would have directed the Department of Justice to tell Americans how they were supposed to talk about this virus. I voted against proceeding to this bill in part because of this crazy, radical idea to impose a speech code on how Americans can talk about this virus. Now, some say, how could you vote against it? Very simple. I will never support a speech code imposed on the American people on how they can exercise their First Amendment rights to talk about this pandemic. This whole idea is deeply concerning, especially because some in the media and some of our Democratic friends believe that even pointing out the virus came from China is somehow inciting violence. That's as foolish as it is dangerous. Calling this virus, which, yes, came from Wuhan, China, the Wuhan virus is not racist and it doesn't incite violence. You may recall, after all, that last year, journalists from such esteemed outlets as CNN, Reuters, The Washington Post, and The New York Times all used the terms Chinese virus, Chinese coronavirus, and Wuhan coronavirus. Were they inciting violence? Were they racist? No, of course not. They were following the centuries-old practice of referring to diseases by geographic names. It wasn't anti-Spanish to call the influenza outbreak in 1918 the Spanish flu, even though it didn't even start in Spain. It's not anti-Egypt to use the term West Nile virus. What about variants of this virus from Brazil, from South Africa, from Great Britain? We use those terms. Is that somehow going to have to be banned from polite society's lexicon as well? Second, I also want to point out that the Democrats' original bill, supposedly about violence against Asian Americans, never actually used the term Asian American, not once. Instead, it had some new manufactured, mysterious term called COVID-19 hate crime. This could have set a precedent for even wider suppression of free speech against citizens who have no animus towards Asians and who haven't committed any crimes. Citizens, for instance, who are concerned about the spread of coronavirus due to the surge of illegal immigration at our border. According to the mainstream media, if you so much as ask a question about the unvaccinated and untested persons entering our country at the border every day, you're somehow bigoted or nativist or a xenophobe. This original version of the bill with the language COVID-19 hate crimes could have resulted in individuals opposed to illegal immigration being reported for merely expressing an opinion. But I'm happy to report that this process, which had a bitter partisan beginning, will soon have a rather uplifting and unifying end, thanks to the diligent work of one of the hardest working senators in the United States Senate, the senator from Maine. These offensive provisions of the Democrats' original bill have been removed. The senator from Maine has helped turn what was a bitter partisan piece of legislation into something that now members of both parties can hopefully support. Thanks to her efforts, this legislation is specifically focused on the crisis at hand and will improve reporting of anti-Asian hate crimes. Soon, we'll also vote on a series of amendments from some of my fellow senators to improve this legislation even further. I look forward in voting for those amendments, for the substitute amendment, and for the bill as amended. So today, this chamber will take a step forward in fighting the rise in anti-Asian violence. I hope that we continue to make progress so that every victim of justice and every victim gets justice and that further attacks are deterred.